It is day 88 since Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home here. It's Nancy's house right behind me in Tucson, Arizona.
Day 88. 88 mornings that Nancy Guthrie's family has woken up and reached for answers that are not there. 88 nights that her home in Tucson, Arizona has sat in the particular silence of a place that has been waiting too long. 88 days since the physical evidence on her front porch, the blood, the aspiration pattern, the marks of a struggle that the scene investigators read like a language told a story about what happened to her that still does not have an ending. That is not a metaphor. That is not rhetoric designed to generate an emotional response. That is the forensic reality of this investigation as of this recording. 88 days. Almost 3 full months. And the Pima County Sheriff's Office has no suspect in custody. No publicly announced suspect at all. No press conference announcing a breakthrough. No forensic development confirmed to the public that has moved this case from the analytical phase into the tactical phase. The silence surrounding this case is doing work. It is important to understand what kind of work it is doing. There is the silence of an investigation that has gone cold, that has no leads left to follow, no evidence left to process, no forward momentum. That is one kind of silence. And then there is the silence of an investigation that is operating in the space between what is known and what is provable, working the methodical, invisible, unglamorous middle distance of a serious criminal case. That is a different silence entirely. The people close to this investigation are clear about which silence this is. This is True Crime Hex. This channel is dedicated to investigating the cases that demand more than a headline. If you are new here, welcome. What follows in this video is not speculation. It is not a summary of other outlet summaries. It is a methodical examination of where the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance stands on day 88, built on the analysis of a man who spent more than 30 years inside the Pima County Sheriff's Office, who served as a SWAT team commander, who understands how investigations of this type are supposed to function, and who has a great deal to say about how the environment surrounding this particular investigation has shaped its progress. His name is Bob Krygier. And his perspective on this case, on the forensics, on the ransom demand, on the FBI's behavioral analysis, on the institutional dysfunction at the top of the department, investigating this case represents the most operationally grounded accounting of where this investigation stands that has been made available to the public. There is a great deal to cover. Let us begin with the foundational question that every person who has followed this case is asking. What is actually happening behind the scenes? And why has there been no public development in a case that began with forensic evidence this significant? The answer requires understanding what the investigative environment looks like at 88 days. In missing persons cases, where the physical evidence at the scene indicates violence, and the evidence at Nancy Guthrie's home is unambiguous on that point, the investigative literature is consistent about one critical reality. The first 48 to 72 hours are the decisive window. Evidence is freshest. Witnesses have not yet had time to rationalize, compress, or unconsciously revise what they observed. Perpetrators have not yet settled into a rehearsed narrative that has been repeated enough times to be internally consistent. The window is narrow, and the information inside it is the most operationally valuable information that will ever exist in the case. That window closed a long time ago. What investigators are working with now is the harder, slower forensic reality that follows the golden window, DNA analysis, genealogical databases, the slow triangulation of tips, sources, and physical evidence into a pattern that is coherent enough to withstand prosecutorial scrutiny. The deliberate, legally precise construction of a case that must survive not just an arrest but a trial, because a case built on shortcuts, on assumptions that were not documented, on evidence handled outside protocol, is a case that a defense attorney can dismantle. And a verdict of acquittal is not justice for Nancy Guthrie's family. It is a second catastrophe that follows the first. Bob Krygier is explicit about this. He confirms that investigators are working. They are processing tips, thousands of them, not dozens, thousands, and the volume of public engagement with this case, while it speaks to how deeply Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has affected people, is also a logistical reality that shapes the pace of what investigators can do. Every tip must be triaged. Every lead that clears a threshold of credibility must be followed up on in a manner that creates a documentable record. A department that is operating under institutional pressures that will be examined in precise detail later in this video is working through that volume as correctly and as completely as circumstances allow. What is not in that volume, and this is the confirmation that matters, is what investigators call a hot tip. Not information that sounds compelling on a true crime forum. Not a theory that has the internal logic of a satisfying narrative. A hot tip is independently corroborated, operationally specific, and actionable enough to move the investigation from the stage of analysis into the stage of tactical response. There are no confirmed hot tips as of this recording. Bob Krygier says this plainly and does not soften it. A source close to the investigation confirms it with equal plainness. Nothing new. No forward movement that can be announced. But there is something else that Bob Krygier says, something that must be named directly because it carries the most weight of anything in this coverage. He believes Nancy Guthrie is likely deceased. He does not say this as certainty. He does not say it for shock value or to generate a response. He says it as the operational read of a man who has worked violent crimes in this county for more than 30 years, who has examined the evidence pattern, the timeline, and most critically, the behavior of the people who took her. The folks who did this, he says, quickly pivoted. That word is going to come back again. Pivot. Because it is the word around which everything else in this analysis turns. Something happened to Nancy Guthrie early, very early, possibly in the first hours after she was taken. What happened caused the people who took her to change their plan. The plan they had formulated, whatever that plan was, became operationally untenable because of something that occurred in that initial period. And in response to that, the perpetrators went silent. They stopped moving in the direction they had been moving. They started focusing their energy on something else, specifically, on not being found. Calling them good bad guys, Bob Krygier says, they just went silent on it and started focusing on something else. That pivot, that change in operational posture from active criminal enterprise to protective silence, tells investigators something specific about the psychology and circumstances of the people they are looking for. People who pivot this way are not professional criminal operators. Professional operators have contingency plans built into the original architecture of their scheme. What the behavior in this case suggests is people who had a plan, encountered an unexpected development, and made a reactive decision rather than a structured contingency decision. That matters. Because reactive decisions leave evidence. Reactive decisions require communication. Reactive decisions are the kind of decisions that eventually come out because someone in the peripheral network of a reactive decision-maker eventually talks. But before going deeper on how Bob Krygier believes this case will ultimately break, and he is precise about, that there is something that needs to be established about the ransom demand. Because the ransom demand in this case is not what it was initially presented as being. This is the point in the video where the request for your support is not optional or promotional, it is operational. Hit the like button on this video. Subscribe to True Crime Hex if you have not already. Every subscriber, every like, every share of this content pushes this story further into the world and into the awareness of people who may have information they have not yet understood is relevant. This case does not resolve without public pressure. This channel does not reach those people without your support. Give this video a like so that more people find this coverage. When a genuine ransom demand is constructed by a criminal enterprise that intends to follow through on it, that intends to hold a person and return them in exchange for payment, it follows a recognizable architecture. The demand reflects the perceived value of the target. It is structured to allow negotiation without the appearance of weakness. It creates communication channels that can be maintained across multiple exchanges. It is, at its operational core, the initial move in a transaction. And the figure demanded reflects the seriousness of the enterprise, the willingness to sustain the scheme through the time and legal exposure required to see it through. The ransom demand in the Nancy Guthrie case was for Bitcoin. Not $10 million, not $5 million, not even a figure commensurate with the apparent planning, the forensic evidence of premeditation, and the documented violence that the scene investigation revealed. The demand was for approximately 1 Bitcoin, or by some accounts, half a Bitcoin. At prevailing market rates, that is a figure that does not align with the operational profile of the crime as the physical evidence describes it. Bob Krygier is asked directly, could the ransom demand have been a cover-up, a misdirection, a way of flooding the investigative environment with a false narrative while the perpetrators adjusted to a situation that had fundamentally changed? His answer is, I think so. He elaborates with a precision that is worth rendering completely. That is not normal for someone who is going to ask for $10 million. Something happened early on with Nancy, and that was part of their pivot. Let us throw that out there to try and get these folks off our scent, our trail. This is a significant reframing. If the ransom demand was not a genuine financial criminal scheme, but rather an instrument of misdirection, a way of redirecting investigative attention toward a kidnapping for ransom narrative, while the actual situation had already moved beyond that, then the entire analytical framework through which the early investigation operated requires revision. Investigators who are following the logic of a ransom demand are asking different questions than investigators who understand they are pursuing perpetrators who are covering the evidence of something that went wrong. The difference between those two investigative postures is not abstract. It is the difference between who you look for and what you ask when you find them. The ransom misdirection, if that is what it was, may have bought the perpetrators time in the early days of the investigation when that time was most valuable. Now, turn to what the FBI says about who these perpetrators are, because the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit has been involved in examining this case. Brian Entin, whose on-the-ground reporting has been the most consistent and operationally grounded public documentation of this investigation, has spoken with FBI profilers about the Guthrie case. Their consensus is not ambiguous. Statistically, the most likely suspect is someone who had contact with Nancy Guthrie, not a family member, necessarily, not a close friend, necessarily, but someone in the perimeter of her life, a contractor, an acquaintance, someone who had been in proximity to her home, her routines, her daily existence in a way that was ordinary enough to be unremarkable but purposeful enough to generate a plan. This is not speculation. This is the behavioral science of targeted violent crime, applied by the professionals at the Bureau whose entire discipline is built on the systematic analysis of criminal behavior across thousands of cases. The probability distribution they are describing, person known to victim versus total stranger, reflects decades of compiled case data. Total stranger attacks do occur. They are real. But in cases of this profile, targeted, premeditated, occurring at the victim's home with evidence of familiarity with the victim's location, the statistical weight falls heavily toward someone known, or known of, or who had some form of prior contact. Bob Krygier, asked whether he agrees with the FBI profiler's consensus, says he would not disagree. That endorsement carries weight. 3 decades of working violent crimes in Pima County. When the operational judgment and the behavioral science point in the same direction, that convergence is not a coincidence. He goes further. I have always thought it was someone who was focused on her for whatever reason, whether it was they knew her, knew of Savannah, one of those things. Savannah. That name appears in Bob Krygier's analysis as a possible vector for the perpetrator's knowledge of Nancy Guthrie. This is not an accusation. Savannah is not a suspect. She is a connection, a thread in the web of relationships surrounding Nancy Guthrie that may, if correctly followed, explain the answer to the question that underlies everything else in this investigation. Why Nancy? Why her home? Why her specifically? The answer to why is not a philosophical question. It is the forensic key that unlocks every other question in this case. And both the FBI and one of the most experienced investigators in Pima County's history are pointing at the same location for that key. The web of Nancy Guthrie's relationships, interactions, and contacts in the period before she disappeared. That web has not yet been fully mapped, but it is being mapped. And somewhere in it, according to the best available analysis, is a person who has spoken about what they did to at least one other person. Because that is how secrets work. That is how they have always worked. Every subscriber to this channel is a person who has decided that Nancy Guthrie's case deserves sustained attention beyond the news cycle. If you have watched to this point, you already understand the commitment that represents. Subscribe to True Crime Hex if you have not already. Share this video. Share it specifically with people in Arizona, with people who had contact with Nancy Guthrie, with people who have heard something they are not sure is relevant. The more people who encounter this coverage, the higher the probability that someone who knows something decides to act on what they know. Hit the like button and subscribe now. This is True Crime Hex. We are watching. The question of how this case ultimately breaks open is one that Bob Krygier addresses with the directness of a man who has seen this pattern play out before. He identifies 2 primary pathways, and both of them are worth examining in detail. The first pathway is discovery. Investigators or searchers find Nancy. If Bob Krygier's operational read of her likely fate is accurate, the discovery of her remains would not end the investigation, it would transform it. Physical evidence associated with a recovery site, handled correctly and processed fully, can generate forensic data that the current investigative record does not possess. The location of a recovery site tells investigators something about transportation routes, about the perpetrator's familiarity with the terrain, about how far they were willing to travel and how they were willing to travel it. The physical evidence at a recovery site, if properly documented, can establish facts that no amount of witness analysis can produce. This pathway is real. It is contingent on a search, which brings us directly to a subject that will be returned to shortly. The second pathway is the one that has broken sealed criminal conspiracies across generations of criminal justice history. Someone talks, not necessarily the perpetrator themselves, not necessarily to the police directly. Someone involved, or someone who knows someone involved, speaks to another person. That person processes what they have heard in the context of what they know about the world. about the consequences of what they are holding, about the weight of a secret this large. And at some point, the calculation shifts. The social or personal cost of speaking becomes lower than the internal cost of continued silence. One of the suspects talking to someone, Bob Krygier says, and that person probably passing that information on, whether it be to a loved one, someone who has a conscience. This is the architecture of how most complex violent crimes resolve, not a forensic breakthrough that arrives with the inevitability of mathematics. The slow erosion of a silence that was never built to be permanent, sustained by people who are not professional criminals, carrying a secret that grows heavier with every day that passes. And at 88 days, that secret is not getting lighter. The DNA evidence remains in process. Physical evidence collected at the scene is being analyzed. Bob Krygier describes this as offering what he calls, with characteristic understatement, some hope, not certainty, not an imminent development, but a thread that has not been fully followed yet. The forensic technology available to investigators in 2024, single nucleotide polymorphism analysis, investigative genealogy, the kind of precision DNA work that has solved cases where a single hair with no attached root was the only biological material available, is extraordinary in its capacity to produce identifications that would have been impossible a decade ago. The evidence is there. It is being worked. There is also the matter of the desert search. The CA United St. John Navy is a group that has the organizational capacity, the personnel, the equipment, and the operational experience to conduct a ground search of the desert terrain surrounding the relevant areas of Pima County. They have done this before. They understand what they are looking at when they are looking at it. They have submitted a formal proposal to the Pima County Sheriff's Office requesting authorization for a search that could directly address the first pathway discovery that Bob Krygier identifies as a potential case-breaking development. The sheriff has not responded. The group is preparing a second proposal. They are not deterred by the silence from the top of the department because they understand something that the sheriff apparently does not, that finding Nancy Guthrie, or finding anything related to this investigation in the terrain where she may have been taken, is not a question of institutional pride. It is a question of results. And results are what the family of Nancy Guthrie has been waiting for through 88 mornings. Bob Krygier does not speculate about the operational reasons for the sheriff's failure to respond to this proposal. He names what he observes and calls it what he thinks it is, probably ego. The posture of institutional insularity that says, "We are the sheriff's department. We can do this ourselves. We do not need outside help." He describes a pattern that has characterized the relationship between this sheriff and external resources across the entire arc of the Guthrie investigation. The FBI lab was initially resisted before eventually being utilized. Other external partnerships that could have accelerated the work were met with resistance before, in some cases, eventually being accepted. The pattern is consistent. Initial refusal, followed sometimes weeks later by reluctant acceptance. It has happened several times in this case, Bob Krygier says. "I will not do this." 2 or 3 weeks later, maybe that was a good idea. Each delay has a cost. In the early stages of this investigation, those delays were measured in the deterioration of evidence, the compression of witnesses' memories, the settling of perpetrators into a rehearsed narrative. At day 88, the delays in utilizing resources like the CA United St. John Navy are measured in time that the investigation does not have in unlimited supply. Bob Krygier adds something about the value of the desert search that extends beyond the immediate case. Groups like the CA United St. John Navy, conducting organized searches in desert terrain, frequently find things unrelated to the case they are searching for. Other remains, other evidence, evidence that has meaning for other families, other cases, other investigations. The forensic geography of the Sonoran Desert around Tucson holds secrets that belong to more than one family. Authorizing this search would not simply be an asset to the Guthrie investigation. It would be a service to Pima County in the broadest sense. The sheriff has not responded. This brings the analysis to the most difficult and most important part of this video. Because the desert search, the resistance to external resources, the institutional insularity, none of these exist in a vacuum. They exist within a department that is, by every observable measure, experiencing a leadership crisis. And that crisis has a specific human face, a specific documented record, and specific consequences for the people trying to find Nancy Guthrie. Bob Krygier is asked to share his assessment of the Pima County Sheriff. He does not characterize what follows as his personal opinion. He characterizes it as documented fact. 4 of them. The first, the sheriff has failed as a leader. Not in the abstract sense of poor performance metrics on an annual review, in the specific documentable sense that the institutional environment he has created has degraded the capacity of the department to function at the level that a case of this gravity demands. The second, The sheriff has lied under oath. This is the most consequential of the four statements. In law enforcement, the sworn statement is not a formality. It is the foundational instrument of legal authority, an officer's capacity to function as a witness, to make arrests that survive prosecutorial review, to participate meaningfully in the legal system they are sworn to serve. All of it rests on the credibility of their sworn word. An officer who lies under oath is not simply an officer who made a moral error. They are an officer whose professional utility has been legally compromised in a way that cannot be undone by apology or reassignment. The third, independent investigators have found that the sheriff expects his commanders to violate the code of ethics as he has violated it. This is not a management failure. It is the systematic downward transmission of corrupt standards through an institutional hierarchy. When commanders receive the signal, implicitly or explicitly, that ethical violations are acceptable because they are modeled at the top, that signal does not stay at the command level. It filters through every layer of the organization. It shapes what rank-and-file investigators understand to be the actual rules, as opposed to the written rules. It erodes the distinction between the authority the department is supposed to wield and the authority it is actually wielding. The fourth, the sheriff has used his position in government for political gain. Mike Ruiz of Fox Digital obtained emails that speak to the dimensions of this, including what has been reported about the relationship between the sheriff's office and a proposed reality television program. The details are not fully explored here, but the pattern they document a public official leveraging the apparatus of office for personal and political benefit is a pattern with a recognizable historical trajectory. It does not end well for the institutions it occupies. Bob Krygier then adds something that goes beyond the enumeration of specific facts. He says the sheriff should be on the Brady List. The Brady List requires a precise explanation because the implications of Brady's status are frequently misunderstood outside the legal profession. The Brady List is not a punitive administrative mechanism. It is a prosecutorial tool derived from the 1963 Supreme Court decision in Brady v. Maryland and its subsequent interpretive evolution. Prosecutorial offices maintain Brady Lists to track law enforcement officers whose credibility has been compromised by documented misconduct, including, specifically, lying under oath. The operational significance of Brady status is this: an officer on the Brady List cannot function as a reliable witness in a criminal prosecution. Their credibility has been legally impeached before they step into a courtroom. Any case they work, any arrest they make, any evidence they collect is subject to defense challenge the moment the Brady status is disclosed. Now, apply that to the institutional reality of the Pima County Sheriff's Office in the context of the Guthrie investigation. The sheriff is not a line investigator. He does not personally collect evidence at crime scenes. His direct participation in the forensic work of the Guthrie investigation is not at the level that would make his individual Brady eligibility a direct evidentiary problem. But the sheriff is the head of the institution. He is the person through whose authority the investigative decisions of the department are ultimately made. He is the person who decides what resources to pursue and what to resist. He is the person whose conduct has created the institutional environment in which the investigators doing the actual work are operating. When a department head has lied under oath, when independent investigators have found that he expects ethical violations from his commanders, when his resistance to external resources has been documented across the entire arc of a critical investigation, the shadow that casts over every decision made under his authority is not a legal technicality. It is a structural integrity problem with consequences that extend well beyond this case. This is the kind of reporting that demands something from the people who consume it, not passive consumption, active engagement. Subscribe to True Crime Hex if you are watching without having subscribed. Hit the notification bell so you receive every update on this case as it develops. Share this video so that the people in Pima County who are watching from inside this situation, the investigators, the department members, the community members who have information they are weighing, understand that this story is being covered by people who are not going to let it go. Every like on this video is a signal that evidence-based, sustained, accountability-driven coverage has an audience that will not be satisfied with less. This is True Crime Hex. We will not look away. The Board of Supervisors has demanded accountability. The sheriff has responded to that demand in a manner that Bob Krygier characterizes, with precise language, as flipping his nose at the board. The response was not a sworn statement. It was not submitted under oath. It satisfied the formal requirement of a response while declining to submit to the substance of what accountability actually requires. The board must now vote on whether to pursue formal removal proceedings. Bob Krygier frames the stakes of that vote in terms that deserve to be quoted at length because they articulate something that gets to the structural heart of why this moment matters. If the board accepts a non-sworn, non-accountable response, from an official who has been documented lying under oath. If they allow this conduct to pass without meaningful consequence, they are transmitting a message through the entire institutional architecture of Pima County government. That message is, lying to this board is acceptable. Violating the code of ethics is acceptable. There are no consequences for those who hold power and choose to abuse it. That message does not stay contained. It does not exist only between this board and this sheriff. It propagates through every institution that looks to the board as the accountability mechanism for local government. It tells every officer in the department what the actual rules are, regardless of what the handbook says. It tells the public what their elected oversight mechanisms are worth in practice, as opposed to what they are worth in theory. The board has not yet voted. The outcome will be a data point in the institutional record of Pima County that outlasts this sheriff's tenure by a long margin. It will be referenced in civil litigation, in departmental training, in the professional histories of every investigator who worked this case and watched the board decide whether institutional accountability has functional meaning in the jurisdiction they serve. Running parallel to the board's deliberations is the recall effort. The signature threshold is over 122,000, with the organizing effort aiming for 125,000 to 130,000 to build a buffer against the legal challenges that accompany any recall. The deadline runs through early July. Bob Krygier acknowledges plainly that this is a tall task. Recalls are logistically and organizationally difficult under any circumstances. A recall of a sitting sheriff in a county of Pima County's size, requiring 6 figures in validated signatures, it is not a certain outcome. But Bob Krygier also states something that provides important context. It has happened before in Pima County. Recalls succeed when the conditions are right and when the organizational effort is sustained with the kind of commitment that this effort appears to be building. He has collected signatures himself, he has advocated publicly. And anecdotally, this is not the kind of data that appears in official reporting. He describes the mood inside the department among people watching this effort as one of guarded optimism. The signature numbers are encouraging the people who are gathering them. There is Heather Lappin. She ran against the current sheriff in the last election and lost by 481 votes. 481. In a county the size of Pima County, that margin represents a near miss of historic significance. It means that the institutional alternative to the current sheriff came within the span of a single neighborhood's voter turnout of prevailing through the normal democratic process. The recall effort is attempting to convert that near miss into a decision. There is Aaron Cross, described as a passionate individual within the agency, the lone voice remaining inside the department who is willing to say publicly what many officers apparently believe privately. That lone voice carries its own significance. It represents the fact that the institution has not been entirely silenced, that there are people inside the machine who have not been socialized into compliance with the standards the sheriff has established at the top. And there is Daniel Boutier, building the public-facing organizational infrastructure of the recall on social media. These names, Lappin, Cross, Boutier, are not figures who arrived at this situation as professional activists. They are people who decided that what is happening inside the Pima County Sheriff's Office is unacceptable and who are building, through the available democratic mechanisms, the conditions for change. Now, let us turn to what all of this means specifically for the people inside the department who are working the Guthrie investigation. Because there is a dimension of this institutional crisis that does not appear in formal records, that does not generate press releases, that cannot be measured in any objective accounting of investigative performance, it is morale. And it matters more than is typically acknowledged. Bob Krygier is direct on this point. The morale inside the Pima County Sheriff's Office was already in serious trouble before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. That is the institutional baseline, the condition of the organization that existed when the most significant missing persons case in recent Pima County history began. The investigators who answered that call, who drove to that house, who looked at the blood on the porch and understood what it meant, they arrived at that scene, already carrying the weight of working in a department whose leadership had damaged the institutional environment. What does that mean? Practically, it means that the conversations about resources, about whether to bring in the FBI lab, about whether to authorize the CA United St. John Navy's search proposal, about how to handle a specific investigative challenge, are happening inside a chain of command that has been compromised at the top. It means that the people doing the actual investigative work are doing it in a context where the institutional decision-making above them has been shaped, at least in part, by factors other than investigative necessity. Ego, political calculation, institutional protectionism. Bob Krygier is careful here. He does not condemn the investigators. He defends them explicitly. They are working their cases correctly. They are following the evidence. They are processing the tips. They are doing the job they were sworn to do in an environment that has made that job harder than it needed to be. And he gives them full credit for that. But he also says this: I suspect there were some hurdles that the investigators had to overcome. Just knowing how departments work, the top will sometimes get too involved, and that might have put some restraints on the investigators. Hurdles, restraints. Those words describe the difference between an investigation operating at its designed capacity and an investigation operating at something less. In a case where every week of delay increases the probability of evidence degradation, of tips going cold, of the perpetrator's silence. Calcifying from reactive to structural operating at less than full designed capacity is not a minor administrative concern. It is a cost measured in time that cannot be recovered. And it is a cost being borne, ultimately, not by the sheriff, not by the investigators, not by the Board of Supervisors. It is being borne by the family of Nancy Guthrie, who wake up every morning and add one more day to a count that should not exist. This is the rhythm of dysfunction, and it has consequences. There will be a CW special on this case, a network production that reflects the level of attention this investigation has generated in the national media. That attention is a resource. It keeps the public record active. It maintains the social pressure on the institutional actors who have the power to change the investigative environment. It extends the period during which the person who is holding the secret that solves this case must weigh the calculus of continuing to hold it against the cost of the world watching and waiting. Every major development in this case is being tracked. Every forensic update, every institutional decision, every signature collected on a recall petition. Every time the Sheriff's Department makes a decision about external resources, about whether to let the CA United St. John Navy search the desert, about whether to utilize the FBI's full capabilities, about whether to operate with the kind of institutional transparency that restores the credibility of an investigation that has been conducted in the shadow of a leadership crisis. All of it is being watched. All of it is being documented. All of it is part of the public record that will eventually be examined alongside the resolution of the case itself, because this case will resolve. That is not hope. It is operational probability applied to the specific facts of this specific situation. The forensic evidence collected at Nancy Guthrie's home is in the possession of investigators. DNA analysis is ongoing. The science available to process that evidence is extraordinary: single nucleotide polymorphism profiling, investigative genealogy, the kind of work that has solved cases built on a single biological sample with no traditional markers. The evidence is there. The technology to read it is there. The people doing the work are there. The tip volume is enormous. Thousands of pieces of information that have not all been processed yet. Inside that volume, there is a non-trivial probability that someone has already provided information that, when correctly contextualized, becomes the thread that unravels the silence. Tips sometimes sit in a queue and only reveal their significance when they can be cross-referenced against other information that arrives later. The investigative process is not always linear. Sometimes a tip from week 3 only makes sense when read against a forensic result that arrives in month 4. The secret itself has a structural fragility. It is being held by people who made a reactive decision under pressure. Reactive decisions made under pressure are not the decisions of professional criminal operators who have planned for indefinite silence. They are the decisions of people who solved an immediate problem and have been hoping, in the time since, that the immediate solution holds. It will not hold forever. It has not held forever in any comparable case. The pressure of public attention, the weight of the secret itself, the possibility that the forensic evidence will produce a result independently, all of it exerts force on the silence. Before the final word on this coverage, a direct appeal. If you are in Pima County, if you crossed paths with Nancy Guthrie, if you have had interactions with someone in her life whose behavior shifted in the period before or after her disappearance, if you have heard something that did not quite fit, something you dismissed, something you filed away, something that has been sitting at the back of your awareness since this story began, contact the Pima County Sheriff's Office. The information you are uncertain about may be exactly the information that allows investigators to cross-reference what they already know into something they can act on. And if you are watching this from outside Arizona, from across the country, from anywhere in the world where this story has reached, subscribe to True Crime Hex, share this video, keep this coverage alive. Every subscriber is a commitment to staying with this case. Every share is an investigative action. Hit the like button, subscribe, turn on notifications. This is how the coverage that Nancy Guthrie deserves reaches the people who need to hear it. Day 88. Here is where the investigation stands, stated plainly and completely. No suspects in custody, no publicly announced suspect. Thousands of tips in process. A forensic record being analyzed, DNA evidence still being worked, a desert search not yet authorized. An institutional leadership crisis that has placed operational hurdles in front of the investigators working the case, a recall effort collecting signatures. A board of supervisors preparing to vote on whether institutional accountability has meaning, a family waiting. And this, the operational probability of resolution is real, not certain, not imminent in any confirmed sense, but real. The evidence exists, the forensic tools to read it exist, the investigative professionals to build a case from it exist. And the human reality of secrets this size, the weight they carry, the relationships they stress, the decisions they eventually force means that the silence will not hold indefinitely. Bob Krygier has been saying, with the calm authority of someone who has watched this pattern play out across decades, that the investigators are doing the work correctly. He has been saying that patience is not passivity, it is the forensic and legal prerequisite for the kind of resolution that holds up in a courtroom. He has been saying that cases like this one, with physical evidence in hand, with public attention sustained, with forensic technology continuing to advance, do not stay sealed. The cases that go unsolved are the cases where the evidence is insufficient, the public attention lapses, and the institutional resources are not properly applied. This case has evidence. The public attention is sustained precisely because coverage like this exists and reaches people who are committed to staying with it. The institutional resources are being complicated by the leadership crisis at the top of the department, but the investigators doing the actual work are not complicit in that crisis, they are working around it. There will be updates. There will be forensic developments to examine. There will be investigative decisions to scrutinize, institutional decisions to document. And eventually, because these cases eventually reach their resolution, there will be an answer that Nancy Guthrie's family has been waiting through 88 mornings to hear. When that answer comes, this channel will be there. Not because the algorithm rewards it, not because it generates the kind of engagement that is measured in 30-second view counts, but because Nancy Guthrie deserves the sustained attention of people who are not going to look away when the news cycle moves on, and because the people who know what happened to her deserve to understand that the world has not forgotten and will not forget. This is True Crime Hex. We stay until there are answers. We will not look away.